Welcome to the Pop Culture Lab. Here we deconstruct your favorite movies and music into their core components. Cameron, let's get in the lab. What's up, Cam?
How's it going, Connor? We've got a lot to talk about this week.
That we sure do, my friend. It's a big one.
Absolutely. James Gunn has made his long-awaited announcements about the trajectory of the DCU, and so we're going to get into that.
Long awaited, if you ask me. January was a very long month.
Yeah, he promised by the end of January, and it was January 31st that he finally came out with these announcements, so I think a lot of DC fans were glad that he held true to his promise, if only technically.
That's true. And he would have had to go to a congressional hearing if he didn't, apparently, so his back was against the wall.
DC fans at the highest levels of office.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. Well, and actually, small tidbit, there's a senator who has appeared in, several Batman movies. He's in The Dark Knight, a number of them. Yeah, he's in Batman vs. Superman, I think. Yeah.
Good guy to know.
Up. He just is put me in all your Batman movies. I was like, great. Man, if I ever held office, that guy would be me.
All right. Well, we do have a lot to get to. We're going to talk about the announcements, definitely. But before we do that, we're going to do a little bit of table setting, talk about the DC universe in movies and how we got to this point where they're facing a pretty big pivot as a studio. So we'll talk about how we got here. We'll go through each of the projects that have been announced. And at the end, we'll do some kind of key takeaways, what we're looking forward to in the next couple years in the DC universe.
Yeah, let's dig in.
Sounds like a plan. All right, well, starting with how we got here. The DC cinematic universe has been troubled, to say the least.
Formerly known as the DCEU.
Exactly. Acronyms are maybe just one of the microcosms in their dysfunction, I would say.
Yeah, it's a symptom of a larger problem, to be sure.
So let's start at the beginning. The DCEU was launched in the... Did it start with the Snyder era?
Yeah, it would have started with Man of Steel, which is 2013. Maybe 2012.
So already they were a little bit behind the eight ball with the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Well, if you really wind the clock back, it depends on how you look at it. Because the success of the Dark Knight movies was huge. And that was 2005 to 2012, roughly. So Iron Man came out in 2008, same year as the Dark Knight. But I don't think its success even touched that of the Dark Knight. Box office is still way bigger. Heath Ledger won an Academy Award. So it didn't quite have that same level. I mean, Robert Downey Jr. actually got nominated that year also in that same category, Best Supporting Actor, for Tropic Thunder.
Interesting.
So his career was in a totally different place. So when you, in retrospect, it looks like the MCU is more successful overall. And between 2008 and 2023, they have been, but their success was coming on the heels of the massively popular Dark Knight movies, which looked like a huge success for Warner Brothers. Not a shared universe, but very successful superhero movies. So.
And it's a little bit easy to get lost in the grand scheme of things because the DC universe has had such bad publicity for so long that people forget that Dark Knight trilogy really kind of set the stage for the superhero era that followed.
Yeah, and I would argue that the modern superhero movie you can trace all the way back to Blade in 1998. Kind of kicked off with that. And then you have the Spider-Man movies and, really the next decades from there. I feel like that's a time between 1998 and 2003, 4, 5. And then 2008 really kicks off a whole new era with The Dark Knight and then the beginning of the MCU. And so... Yeah, easy to retroactively compare, but like we alluded to, the success of DC has gone in waves, shall we say.
So, following the Dark Knight trilogy, times were good at DC. They were the darling in a lot of ways of the comic book world with the success of that Heath Ledger performance in particular. So, what went wrong in the next era where they hired Zack Snyder, they started Man of Steel? What was the left turn?
Well, good question. And lest we not forget, Christopher Nolan practically hired Zack Snyder. He was a producer on Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman. So he was very supportive in starting that whole new universe. So in a lot of ways, he thought Zack Snyder was the guy. And for a time, Warner thought Zack Snyder was the guy. Watchmen was fairly well received. Not perfect, but pretty good. Made a lot of money. So when these movies just didn't do as well, box office wise, that was a big part of it. I think it mostly has to do with the critical and just like consumer reception to his movies. Because I think he actually did a good job of making a shared universe in a lot of ways. If you look at Man of Steel to Zack Snyder's Justice League, there's a clear style, visually, thematically. He introduces Batman pretty seamlessly. If anything, Superman takes a back seat, but he quickly turns everything into an ensemble, like the Justice League.
Right.
So in 3 movies, he manages to build a lot of universe, to his credit. But it's just that people didn't like the style. It wasn't palatable. It was too dark and gloomy and didn't have Marvel jokes. And, I give them credit for trying to do something different than Marvel, but I think it was just too Zack Snyder-y.
And that started sort of a next phase at DC where they were chasing something that would bring audiences to theaters to see their movies. And so they started going in a lot of different directions. What did that look like?
Well, I think the big theme of this phase of the DC EU was definitely trying to imitate Marvel more. They kept some of the shared DC Universe stuff, Shazam, eventually Black Adam, Aquaman movies,
Wonder Woman, yeah, the sequel.
Yeah, those are in the Snyderverse, for lack of a better term, DCEU. So they definitely tried to shift tone. Wonder Woman maybe less so, but definitely lighter, more levity. Aquaman, definitely. James Wan brings that. It's straight up wacky. You got a octopus playing the drums and stuff. Shazam is very fun. It's big. Tom Hanks big as a superhero movie. So
it's also just big in its action and its characterization. It's less gloomy. It's more kind of out there.
Yeah, and popcorny and fun. Definitely more in the style of Marvel. So they definitely go for that, but they also don't lose sight of their profitable characters. Harley Quinn, they continue to pump those out, but she's really fun too. She lends herself well to that. Birds of Prey, bars from Deadpool, like monologuing and very silly, more maybe raunchy jokes and stuff. But then the Batman, Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, those movies are not fun and light at all, but they are highly profitable characters that they leaned into with like strong creative directors. And so that's one approach too. I think they took the let's imitate Marvel and see what happens, and let's continue making movies with characters that we know will gross close to $1 billion if we're lucky.
And they had some success with that. But there was no clear direction. There was no kind of alignment between these different projects. And I think audiences caught on to that. There was a little bit of confusion about how they were connected, about how one director's style kind of tied in with the rest of the big picture for the DCU.
Well, even like we said with Wonder Woman, sort of different tonally than like Shazam, right, which is okay. There's room for that. The MCU has a variety of tones, especially more recently. But Kevin Feige kind of lends the Feige touch across it all, like especially early MCU. There's something that Iron Man and Captain America and, kind of the early movies all share. If anything, it's restrictive of the movies and the tones, and the directors don't have as much of a sandbox to play in like maybe Taika Waititi does later down the road. But to get in like a shared universe off the ground, you need that consistency touch. And so there was nobody at DC making sure that there was that cohesion. Like literally Marvel has teams of people being like, if we're bringing a character back from another movie, what's the last thing we saw them doing, and how do we touch on that? And it fits together like a puzzle. And the DCU was not like that. They just like, well, let's throw it at the wall and see what sticks, and we'll say it's in a universe, but there's no real apparatus holding connective tissue
right
amongst these movies.
So this era of the DCEU is where we first see James Gunn in DC movies. He had created Guardians of the Galaxy and made them popular in the Marvel universe. And here he takes on a couple of projects for DC. He directs The Suicide Squad, the sequel to the less successful first edition of that movie. And he also takes on... What else?
What has he done so far with DC?
Yes.
Peacemaker show.
That's right.
I think that's it. The Suicide Squad, the Peacemaker show. Yeah, that's the big stuff.
And he has said in recent interviews that even as a director for DCU, he was kind of struggling to see how his project would fit into some kind of bigger picture.
Right. I mean, he made that diss recently, like they'd give IP to anybody who smiled at them, and he was definitely one of those people. They were like, let's see what James Gunn can do for our universe.
Absolutely.
Yeah, making a sequel / remake, reusing characters, bringing new ones, killing off huge swaths. Yeah, there's just clearly no plan. If you allow a director to come in and kill off 12 characters, you didn't have a plan in the first place.
Exactly. It actually has echoes of the recent Star Wars universe, where they had J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson, directly contradicting things that happened in the previous movie.
Right. Rian Johnson's kind of like, I didn't like that they just made the first two movies into one movie and modernized it, so I'm going to kind of axe everything that happened in that movie.
And then they brought in J.J. Abrams, who did essentially the exact same thing to whatever Rian Johnson had brought forward in the second movie.
Right. He was like, why'd he kill Snoke and make a mess of my little thing? I'm going to make it shitty again.
So before we move into the hiring of James Gunn to oversee the future of the DC universe, let's briefly just talk about the ongoing comparisons and competition between DC and Marvel, which is, it's already come up quite a bit in this conversation. They are inextricably linked. Long before they were movie universes, they were comic book, competitors, and they were competing for the same audiences. And so that has been many decades of competition between them two. So DC and Marvel have both come out with many movies. Marvel, over 30, I think, at this point, in the last 15 years. And to varying levels of success. DC's had some winners. The Dark Knight certainly is in there. And Marvel has had some big winners as well, Endgame being one of the highest grossing movies of all time.
Yeah, and even outside of shared universes, if you're bringing up The Dark Knight, I mean, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies were very successful, too. And that was good for the Marvel brand.
So, for better or worse, Marvel and DC are inextricably tied. And at this point in their cinematic development, they have some reputations that they carry with them. Marvel, because of the success and the box office success of their products, means that they have a little bit more freedom to work with. They know that there's a built-in audience who will come to see their shows or movies or whatever content they come out with. Pretty much no matter what level or intended audience it is, we've seen them experiment a little bit more with some teen content, a little bit more of an adult tone. But there's so many Marvel fans that they'll come and see it. DC...
We're looking at you, other podcasts.
Exactly. There's a little bit of a fan base who are prepared to like just about anything that comes out from Marvel.
Just a little.
DC, on the other hand, has some negative reputation to overcome when they come out with a new project. There's a little bit of skepticism about the level of quality, certainly, the tone, and that sometimes has hampered some really good projects that people don't come out to see or they expect to be bad.
Yeah, or even things just get, more hatred than they deserve. Like, Black Adam did not reinvent the wheel. It's not the most amazing superhero movie ever by any stretch, but it deserved more than it got. If it just had the Marvel logo on it instead of the DC, I swear it would have had like twice as high a Rotten Tomatoes score. It would have been a 70, not a 35 or whatever. I swear.
Right. The groupthink on the internet has certainly not been kind to the DC projects.
Right.
Whereas, both of us were a little surprised when the Guardians of the Galaxy holiday special came out, which I don't think either of us particularly liked. It was fine. It had Kevin Bacon, and that's pretty much its only claim to fame. But it had a 90-some approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Right. Compared to what? The Star Wars holiday special?
Right.
Like renowned garbage?
Right.
I guess.
And that was, to bring us full circle, that was a James Gunn project. So let's get right into it. So we've covered how we got here. DC has a bit of a PR problem to overcome. And so what do? They hire James Gunn, famous for the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise on the Marvel side and for dipping his toes into the DC with the Suicide Squad and with the Peacemaker show. So they announced 3 months ago, something like that, James Gunn was going to be essentially their version of Kevin Feige. This kind
with
of...
Peter Safran. We can't totally forget about Mr. Safran and the value he brings to the team with James Gunn. He produced Aquaman, Shazam, so he has DC history. He's loved by the actors. He brings business acumen. So he is an important part of the team that we shouldn't forget about and focus only on James Gunn. But creatively, James Gunn's probably driving the bus.
And this allows DC to kind of turn the page on that era. So let's get into some of the reasons that we see, some of the special qualities that James Gunn brings to the DC universe and what we might expect moving forward in terms of what this pivot will look like. So one of the big things that we can draw from, thankfully, is the statements in the interviews that James Gunn has been making recently. He has been surprisingly forthright about some of the drawbacks of the DC and how it's been run up until this point, which gives us a little bit of insight into what they're probably going to be doing in the future.
Well, and I'd like to add, his transparency in general is very cool and very special. Not even Kevin Feige has that. He is the wizard behind
the company
the curtain.
man, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, he's maybe more akin to Peter Safran in this case. It remains to be seen. But he's not on Twitter shooting down fan theories and stuff. And so it's really cool. Zack Snyder was pretty involved with the fans, but James Gunn takes it to a whole new level. He's, literally, yesing to this, knowing to that. It's like very involved in the weeds, in the fan community. It feels like he's one of us in a way that maybe no other like major comic book movie head has done quite so far.
So that's one of the things that he brings is accessibility to the fans, engagement with fans.
Yeah. Builds
and,
trust.
And exactly, to go along with that, credibility, which is something that maybe DC has struggled with in the past.
Yeah, which partly comes from his transparency and partly comes from his experience with, like you said, Guardians of the Galaxy. His very, I think, first feature movie is a movie called Super with Rainn Wilson, like a guy who decides to be a superhero. So it's a theme through his entire filmmaking career, even prior to Marvel. So yeah, I think that transparency and that credibility comes from working with these characters, being a true fan, and having the success of taking, like you said, unknown characters and bolstering them into household names.
Right. He has credibility not only with fans, but also with movie studios. They know that he can run a money-making production.
Right. And Rumpelstiltskin style, turn nothing into gold.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about what tonally this might look like in the DC universe, definitely that focus on some of the underappreciated heroes and villains, the ones that you don't necessarily know about. I don't know any comic book movie fans who knew who most of the Guardians of the Galaxy were until they saw that movie, for instance.
Right. Characters we don't know or care about, interestingly enough, but we are going to care about them, whether we want to or not. Weasel is here to stay.
Whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
So credibility is something he definitely brings. When we talk about vision, there's definitely a sort of tone that James Gunn projects are known for that's very playful, light, some of the sort of heartwarming aspects.
Though he would caution you from assuming that this is going to be the Gunverse.
Sure.
In the way that the DCEU was the Snyderverse. Even Wonder Woman feels affected by Zack Snyder's, at least visual sensibilities. I think James Gunn is smart enough and creative enough to allow directors to do more of their own thing, more akin to what Marvel is now doing. But he's going to be helping that connective tissue piece. But I don't think everything's going to be fart jokes and penis jokes and John Cena for the foreseeable future.
Right. I think that is what is still most to be determined, I think, is that balance between the consistency, the cohesion that that DC is looking for that was maybe missing from this most recent era of the DCU. How that cohesion matches with creative, flexibility for directors who would take on some of these projects. Marvel has certainly been guilty of maybe too samey of a tone for their projects, which is leading to what people are calling superhero fatigue. And so I'm curious how DC is going to approach that and how James Gunn is going to approach that with his, directors that he chooses for some of these projects.
Well, yeah. And if you ask some of our friends like Mr. Sarr, superhero fatigue extends to just, I'm tired of seeing anything remotely related to superheroes,
sure,
including Joker, anything. But the fact that my fiance can still get into Joker tells me there's still some appetite because she has no interest in this stuff. But also what I'm interested to see, kind of along the lines of what you just said, James Gunn's Superman movie, he's been doing all these ensemble things. Guardians, Suicide Squad, I guess Peacemaker's focused on one character, but when you see it, you'll see that Amanda Waller's core group from Suicide Squad are in this show, and he has a friend in it. It feels like an ensemble. So it'll be interesting to see what he does with like a titular character like Superman. I mean, knowing James Gunn, I bet Jimmy Olsen will show up. Cute, fun Jimmy Olsen, and Lois Lane will play a big role. So there might be some ensemble piece, but tonally even for James Gunn, I'm interested to see what he does with like one main character. And maybe that would be a template for something like Brave and the Bold, Batman. Yes, he's got a son. Yes, Bat family, but more focused on a singular character, maybe.
Don't get too far ahead of me here. Let's wrap up the remaining projects.
Sorry, my crystal ball was showing me some stuff.
We will get to the lineup that has been announced, but before we do that, there are a couple remaining projects that are coming out this year from this most recent era of the DCEU, which is Shazam: Fury of the Gods coming out on March 17th. The Flash, the long-awaited Flash movie, is coming out on June 16th, as long as all things remain the same. That movie has been shifted, and the release date has shifted several times now.
Just do nothing, Ezra. Nothing at all.
And Blue Beetle coming out on August 18th. And then finally, the Aquaman sequel, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, coming out December 25th, Christmas Day.
Oh, yeah, so it is. Wow.
So anything in that era, how do you think that is going to translate into this sort of transition period between the last era and the new one?
Well, I found it interesting in James Gunn's announcement. He spoke of these movies inclusively into his universe. You know, he didn't sort of make it sound like, well, them over here and me over here. He was kind of like, we've got an exciting upcoming slate of DC movies, which will transition into Waller. I mean, the things you're going to talk about in just a minute. But that's kind of kicks off the official DCU. But because of its proximity to these movies, and it sounds like... So, I guess, let me back up. The Flash is really important because it resets everything.
Absolutely.
So, it is the connective tissue between the DCEU and the DCU.
So let's briefly jump just a little bit into that movie, the Flash movie, which is based on a very famous episode of the comic books, which had, you know, earth-shattering implications for the world that they had built in the DC universe, comic book-wise. It allowed them to massively reset all of these main characters that we all know and take it in a completely different direction. And so when you think about where the DC cinematic universe is right now, this Flashpoint arc is kind of a perfect inflection point for them to transition into a new vision.
Well, and what's interesting is this movie is left over from the previous regime. Mm-hmm. So it was going to allow them to do a reset. But James Gunn recently said that the way the movie is constructed, it still allows them to do a reset, the new DC people. So that's amazing. Like, what about this movie wipes the slate so clean that anybody could pick up where it leaves off, basically? So I find that very interesting. It's touted as a very good movie. So yeah, I think, you know, that movie they're keeping it for that reason, but it's going to be the thing that blends the two. I think the Flash character could stick around. We'll see how the politics unfold. And the other movies, Aquaman 2, Shazam 2, those are just... Blue Beetle. Well, the other ones are left over just because of successful box office, basically. They're just going to keep those and, you know, if something worked, try it again, sort of a thing. But the way James Gunn talked about Blue Beetle, that's still included in his universe, even though that was created by someone prior. He's going to incorporate Blue Beetle into his. It will share the same universe as his new Superman, et cetera, et cetera. They could be all on the screen in one, you know, mashup movie one day. So
it seems like they have a couple of movies coming out that were from this previous slate, but still to be determined how exactly they fit into the big picture. I think everyone's still trying to figure out which of the kind of headline actors from the previous era are going to stick around. We already know that Henry Cavill is not going to be as Superman.
Yeah.
And we know that Ezra Miller and his kind of troubled time as the Flash is still to be determined based on how, that plays out in the press and in his personal life.
And the reception to the movie, probably.
That is definitely going to be a big factor as well. So, enough of this. Let's get into the really fun stuff. There's quite a few new projects that were announced. James Gunn released a video on Twitter, and it's been making the rounds this week. So, let's start. We have Creature Commandos, which is a animated series, and that's going to be the first entry into the Gunniverse, even though he is not fond of that term.
Right. The DCU official start.
So what do you think of Creature Commandos?
Well, he's keeping Weasel, like we said. So Weasel survived the Suicide Squad for a reason, apparently. I think, like I mentioned to you earlier, I think it's interesting to start in an animated thing. I think it's just worked out that way. I don't think, if they didn't have the movies coming out this year, they probably wouldn't have started with something animated like this. So it's an interesting approach, but I'm excited personally. Reoccurring characters, introducing some new ones. Maybe we'll see Amanda Waller pop up, animated, voiced by Viola Davis. Frankenstein's a character. He leads the Creature Commandos. That's weird. So we have a DCU Frankenstein before we have a Superman. So,
and already I feel like we're getting a little bit of a sense of what Gunn's touch, his fingerprints on these projects is going to be. It's kind of playful, quirky,
ensemble,
right?
Characters you don't know. Yeah, it's all there.
And that pivots right into Waller, which James Gunn shared was going to be a pretty important piece of building out the framework for what's coming next, because Amanda Waller is kind of a Nick Fury-like character for those who are more familiar with the Marvel movies.
Sort of. I would push back on that a little as a more of a comic book DC fan. If Nick Fury was really, really mean and sort of had this ends or means justify the ends attitude about everything, that would be Amanda Waller. And comic Nick Fury is just kind of a badass, and he's not this overseer guy of all these superheroes. They just use him for that in those movies. Amanda Waller is more powerful than the president, as smart as Lex Luthor and Batman, and mean and ruthless, and just ultimately, sometimes looking out for the benefit of planet Earth, but willing to throw a lot under the bus for that.
But the benefit of having this Waller TV show come out so front-loaded at the beginning of this new era is that it allows them to bring in a lot of new characters.
And ones we've seen before. Because Waller Season 1 will bridge Peacemaker Season 1 and Season 2. Because a lot of characters are all shared from that. Like I said, Amanda Waller's little computer support group who run everything behind the scenes in the Suicide Squad, they're in Peacemaker. And so I'm sure we'll see those characters again.
One of the things I'm really excited about for this Waller TV show is that one of the writers is Crystal Henry, who wrote for the Watchmen HBO series. Mm-hmm. And I adored that show. I thought it was excellent.
As did we all.
Yes, and so that's really exciting. I'm intrigued with where they're going to take that.
Yeah, and both shows have a woman of color lead, which is interesting and cool. So I think a strong character that she's a police officer in Watchmen. She kicks ass, she's tough, and so I think it'll be cool to see how they write for a character like Amanda Waller. And already you should watch Peacemaker, because she has a daughter in that. They do a good job of humanizing her, but they still show what a ruthless, insert expletive here, she is. So I'm really excited about this. I think Viola Davis is dynamite casting. So if they write as well for this as they did for Watchmen, and even the racial elements of Watchmen were so, I think, expertly written. There's a lot you can do with Waller, and even addressing how rare it is to see a woman of color in such a position of power, and you could just explore a lot, I think, with the show.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, Viola Davis is just such an excellent actress that it's good to see that she's going to hang around.
Yeah.
So that takes us into the first major movie of this next era, which is, not pulling their punches. It's Superman Legacy. It's the kind of the biggest superhero in their arsenal, although I know the guy sitting across from me with a Batman tattoo is probably going to debate on that one.
The box office speaks for itself, my friend.
So Superman Legacy is coming out. It's going to be directed by James Gunn himself, which is interesting. And they have set a target release date for July 2025, which gives them just over 2 years.
That's fast.
Very fast. Wouldn't be surprising to see this one pushed out.
But it's being written, maybe in the later stages, which would mean if they start pre-production and filming in 2024, it's tight, but it's possible. Marvel works pretty quickly too, and I think he's trying to learn from that. But he explicitly said that he doesn't want to do what Marvel does, in the sense that they will have unfinished scripts and they'll start shooting the movie. And they'll be like, we'll just write this as we go. Multiverse of Madness was definitely like that. That's why it feels messy to some degree. I think Love and Thunder wasn't so different, actually. So James Gunn does not want to do that because story is king. He said it 5 times.
Right.
And you have to have a finished script before you start shooting something. And so even though it's an aggressive schedule, it's going to be written first.
Well, and that's music to my ears. As a moviegoer, I care a lot more about great writing and a tight plot than I do about, all the bells and whistles of, CGI and making it look pretty. Those are all important when you're making an action comic book movie, don't get me wrong. But unless you have a good screenplay at the heart of this, and this is definitely something that James Gunn has emphasized, is going to be really important to their projects.
Yeah.
So what are you expecting out of this Superman movie? He has said that it's not going to be an origin story. Mm-hmm. It's going to focus on Superman, balancing his Kryptonian and his human sides, which I think makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's definitely an ongoing theme for that character.
For me, what I expect, younger than Henry Cavill. I think in some ways it's borrowing from the Batman in terms of not an origin story, but learning to be the person you're going to become, that sort of a thing. It's going to explore him joining the Daily Planet, I think, and early days as a reporter. I hope it actually shows more of the journalism side of Superman and Clark Kent. I think that's interesting. He's actually a pretty good journalist, I think, in the cartoons and comics. They do a little bit of that in Batman vs. Superman, the extended edition. It's cut from the movie, but he's talking to people on the street, learning about Batman, finding out all this stuff, being an actual journalist. So it'd be fun to see that. I think having a legitimate Jimmy Olsen would be great. He's a great character. He was included in the Snyderverse for 2 seconds as kind of a joke, and then he was murdered immediately. Classic. So it'd be nice to have a real Jimmy Olsen. I expect him to introduce Lois Lane, of course.
Wouldn't be a Superman movie without Lois Lane.
No, of course not. And I think he's hopefully going to lean, like you said, into the duality. Christopher Reeve is sort of praised and loved for bringing such an important aspect of that to what he did in the older movies in the 70s. Because there's a scene I watched, even in film class, they showed us this, not because superheroes are cool, because it was a really well-made scene. And it's Clark Kent looking in the mirror at Lois's apartment, and she's getting dressed and talking to him, and the whole time she blows him off because he's Clark Kent. She thinks he's a dork, a loser. and he's like looking himself in the mirror, and you know that he knows that he's Superman, and it's great. I hope they really lean into the duality of that character and like how much Clark Kent is this mask. There's a great speech at the end of Kill Bill where Bill talks to Uma Thurman about like, he's like, Clark Kent is Superman's critique of humanity. He thinks we're weak. He thinks we're pushovers. Like, in order to be a convincing human being, he basically acts like a total loser.
All the negative things about humanity.
Which I think isn't coincidence. And I think, and as an outsider, as an immigrant, I think these movies would do well to focus on the nuances of embodying in that. Yeah.
Well, and I'd love to see that because, you know, when it's not executed well, the Superman character is so easy to be this archetype of perfection. And there has been, in some of the projects that I've seen with Superman as a lead, it can just become kind of flat.
Yeah, just Boy Scout guy.
Exactly. And so to humanize, to really show the flaws of Superman, even though he is this kind of perfect encapsulation of kind of the ideals of superhero dumb, that would be an interesting thing to explore, and that I'm hoping we're going to see more in this project.
I think so. And Zack Snyder kind of made the mistake of making Superman too gloomy. Like, he moved away from the Boy Scout thing, but like dark, edgy Superman.
And cold is what I found.
Right. And as good as Henry Cavill was, he looks like Superman. He does a good job, but the character was fundamentally flawed from the gate. I think the thing that really resonated with me, and that I didn't mention yet, in his description of this, James Gunn said something like, the movie is going to be about how Superman is like an optimist in a world that thinks that's old-fashioned. He's, what is the word that they used? It was like...
He said, it focuses on Superman balancing his Kryptonian heritage with his human upbringing. He's the embodiment of truth, justice, and the American way. He is kindness in a world that thinks that kindness is old-fashioned.
That's what it is. Kindness, being old-fashioned. That is awesome because, well, the stupid Christmas special was too corny, but James Gunn is not afraid to be corny or sentimental. And I think a great way to look at Superman is like, he is a relic of another time. He's like, I don't know, like the 60s, this smiling guy in the 60s that never kind of stopped smiling. So like kindness, yeah, it is almost like, because movies nowadays are edgy, this, cynical. That, like, right, so cynical now. So if he can really, really tap into like, just, it's okay to just be a good old-fashioned good person, like that might be really refreshing.
Well, and that's going to put so much on the actor that plays him to feel authentic, because it's so easy when you're trying to do something like that for it to feel inauthentic. It's really going to rest on that actor. And so I think you're right. They definitely want to hire a Superman who's going to grow with the character, somebody who's going to hang around for quite a few years probably.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm expecting this to be somebody that we're not familiar with. It's going to be an actor who's probably still growing their career.
I think so. And I think charisma and authenticity are going to be primary, like most important things here, because we have to feel like, yeah, he's authentically a good person. If we sense any degree of acting like, oh, gee, I'm such a good guy, it has to look really coming from the most genuine place.
Right. Well, let's keep moving. This next project is one of the ones that I'm most excited for. It is a Lanterns TV show. Yes, that's multiple lanterns, and those are green. So that's exciting. Both of us, before this announcement came out, we were wondering which incarnation of the Green Lantern was going to be, appearing, and it turns out multiple.
Also, before you move on to Lanterns, The Batman Part 2, not Chapter 2, not DC Universe technically, but coming out also in 2025, months after Superman. So I just think it's worth noting, never happened before. Superman movie, Batman movie, the two big dogs, 1 year. Pretty exciting.
As long as those dates don't move, yes.
Well, sure.
And that is
COVID too.
That is the Batman movie that just came out. Matt Reeves' project has Robert Pattinson in the lead role.
Yes.
Sort of a noir style incarnation of the Batman.
Yeah. But Lanterns, super cool. Apparently True Detective style. So they're space cops, even though it is a terrestrial mission in this one.
This sounds like so much fun to me.
It does. And Ryan Reynolds played Hal Jordan famously in that movie. We have not seen Jon Stewart. That's the other Green Lantern. He was beloved from the animated shows of the 90s and stuff. He was set to appear in Zack Snyder's Justice League, but was replaced by Martian Manhunter just due to studio interference. So very cool to have them both. As we have talked about in the past, I think Jon Stewart brings like a pragmatism maybe that Hal Jordan doesn't. Mm-hmm. I'm probably not as familiar with Hal Jordan, actually. I've always saw him as a little bit generic as a superhero. And I just liked the animated shows, so it was always Jon Stewart then. But I always, like I've talked about with you, he, in many instances, will talk about, ends justify the means kind of a thing. He's very adaptable to different situations. He always has his eye on like what he should be doing, and he's kind of willing to do whatever it takes to get there. Like even in ways sometimes that would make Batman go, "What?" Like,
well, and ends justify the means. This is the second project that we've talked about where that's come up. That is definitely a different tone than Marvel tends to play with.
Yeah,
they usually have pretty clear-cut heroes who, even when they may have some questionable actions, you usually know it's coming from a good place. I would say Wanda Maximoff is maybe the one exception there. And when they had her become kind of a heel turn, there were a lot of fans who were really unhappy with that. They wanted Wanda to be a hero. And so when they made her into a pretty clear villain in Multiverse of Madness, there were a lot of fans who didn't like that.
no.
DC is much more comfortable making morally questionable heroes, anti-heroes, really. And I think we can expect to see a lot more of that.
I think it's more rooted in their comics too. But James Gunn's definitely not afraid of it. I mean, another project you're going to talk about has that in spades.
Well, let's move right into that, actually. Yeah. The Authority
yeah.
is going to be coming out. This is really where I feel like the James Gunn's pulling out all the stops. He's going deep into the vault to bring these heroes out. I know I'm not familiar with these folks. I don't think you are either.
No.
So,
but what's cool about this, one thing I feel like James Gunn is doing is now you have so many superhero properties, right? Just a sea of superhero stuff. So you can look across the board, regardless of who the content creator is. You can be like, what has worked and what hasn't? The Boys recently has been super successful. Mm-hmm. And I think this movie in particular is really trying to tap into that. It's going to be an increased violence, questionable morals, characters that are reminiscent of other characters. There's like a quasi Batman guy who's one of the characters in the Authority. So I think they're really looking for like Boys style. If that movie isn't rated R, I'll be surprised. Let's put it that way.
The comparison that Safran made was that they're going to be like Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men. So if that tells you anything, that's the tone that they're going for.
You can't handle the truth.
Yeah, I'm excited for that one as well. Moving right along, Paradise Lost. So they're calling this a sort of Game of Thrones-y is how they described it. Kind of more of a...
In their dreams.
Of course. But it's going to be more political intrigue, that type of thing. Probably more dialogue-heavy than action-heavy is what I would expect.
Probably. I'm sure plenty of action. Game of Thrones had a lot of heads getting chopped off and stuff.
Sure. And this takes place on...
Themyscira.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Also known as Paradise Island.
Exactly, which is
Hence the
the
name.
homeland of Wonder Woman,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So
And
that
how are they called? Amazons? Yeah. Amazons.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that should be interesting as well.
And Gal Gadot is producing, interestingly. Not sure why.
And who knows? They haven't written out her involvement in future projects as Wonder Woman in the way that they have with Superman and Henry Cavill.
And what's interesting is they specifically said that the events of this show take place before the events of the movies. So they're connected? Question mark?
Could be, going back to, ancient times and doing some stage setting for the character of Wonder Woman.
It's either that or the power vacuum left by her departure, which is, I guess, actually in the first movie. So that would be after that.
We do see some flashbacks in that first movie.
Yeah, but she leaves the island in that movie. So if it were the power vacuum, it would have to take place after that. So if it's before, I think you're right. It is. Yeah. I think it's about when they kind of branched off from the rest of humanity and became. It's how they came to be on a little island that's disguised that you can't see.
Yeah, when they described it as a sort of Game of Thrones in tone, I was assuming that was more about the political intrigue and the dialogue, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was also kind of medieval in some of the trappings as well.
It will.
Yeah.
Swords and stuff.
Absolutely. So next up we have the Brave and the Bold. Now, you're not really interested in this one, right? We can just move right along.
Sorry, who's Batman?
Yes, Brave and the Bold. This is going to be the introduction of Batman.
I thought you said
into
the
DCU.
Brave and the Bald.
Oh yeah, exactly.
The new season of Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Larry David as Batman would be an interesting incarnation.
Oh my god. It's pretty good.
So Bruce Wayne is coming back. He's got family. Tell me about the Brave and the Bold.
Oh, Damian. Yes. Yeah, you're going to see Bat Dad for the first time in cinematic history. Damian Wayne is the son of Batman. That is how he is known. He's the son of Batman and Talia al Ghul in the comics. So
Who fans will know, movie fans will know from The Dark Knight Rises.
Yes. Marion Cotillard.
Right.
Liam Neeson's daughter. Liam Neeson. Ra's al
The
Ghul.
villain from the first movie.
Right. Could also be pronounced Raish al Ghul. Maybe this movie will go with that pronunciation. That'd be interesting. Maybe just to differentiate itself. But he's raised by them and the League of Assassins, not the League of Shadows. Christopher Nolan made that up. League of Assassins. So that is who the Al Ghul family really runs in the comics, is this League of Assassins. And Damien's raised by all these people. So he's raised like, killing's awesome. Killing's cool. I kill for breakfast. And then when he's under the wing of Batman, Batman's like, no killing. And he's like, what do you mean? How do we have fun around here? So immediately an interesting conflict right off the bat. We probably won't see Batman kill, but we'll probably see Batman's son kill, and Batman's reaction to that. That's interesting to explore. Are we going to see the Al Ghuls in this movie? I mean, just their relationship. I'm going to go on a huge tangent here because their relationship suggests so many things. The Al Ghuls, Talia, Raz, Raish, whatever you want to call them, they're off somewhere because they raised him. If he's Robin, then ostensibly we've had Dick Grayson, Tim Drake, and Jason Todd, who gets murdered. So all Robins, he's the final Robin. So there's a Batgirl, there's been two Robins, Dick Grayson has grown up and become Nightwing. Are we going to see all that stuff? And he did kind of say the larger Bat family. So you could be looking at it like 6 new Batman characters never before seen on screen. Like all the Gotham Knights characters, basically. Red Hood, Nightwing, Batgirl, all of it.
With so many Robins dying off, I hope he has some life insurance.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. And if it's not clear, Damian Wayne is Robin. He's
Right.
the last Robin, so, and the most deadly.
That'll be interesting to explore. Obviously, Batman's unwillingness to kill as being kind of this red line he will not cross is pretty definitive to that character. And so seeing how he wrestles with that with his son in a very different approach to life should be interesting to explore.
Absolutely. And just as a parent, you know, with other Robins, it was always like he was protective of them. They're his ward or whatever, but this is his blood.
Son, yeah.
If something happens to this kid, it hits just a little harder than Jason Todd dying. Sorry, Jason.
Lastly, we know that this is not going to be tied into the Matt Reeves Batman project. It's not going to have Robert Pattinson. It's going to have different casting.
No. And so when they said, we're not going to have like 3 Batmans running around at the same time,
Maybe they will.
they were like, well, not 3, 2.
2. Okay, moving right along, we have Booster Gold, which is...
One last thought on that. Speaking of multiple Batmans, I mean, what about the Rogues Gallery for The Brave and the Bold? The Reeves verse has to have villains, and the DCU has to have villains, and they're pulling from the same bucket.
Right.
So how many of the same characters are we going to see? I don't know. The Joker. Everybody loves the Joker. Are we going to have Joaquin Phoenix, Barry Keoghan, and somebody else? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. Maybe not. Maybe they'll just be like, Joker's dead in this universe. But then people will be like, oh.
It'll be interesting to see how they move forward with that. They have... skipping a little bit ahead here, James Gunn did talk about the differentiation between sort of the cohesive DCU moving forward, which is all going to be in a shared universe, and they're going to have other projects in what they're calling the Elseworlds.
Yeah.
So these will be very clearly designated as outside of the continuity of the main universe.
Right. Like if Harley Quinn, Margot Robbie continues, we'll also have Lady Gaga, Elseworlds, Harley Quinn.
Right.
You know, she's 34.
Really?
Oh my God. That blew my mind. Made me feel...
Unaccomplished?
Yeah, seriously. It's like, what? She's like
been
won
busy.
Oscars and Grammys, and I assume she was like 40
She's
something.
probably gotten an EGOT already.
Dude, I was like, whoa. She put out her big hits, like, she was 4 years older than us. That was like, what, 2009 or 10 or something?
That's crazy.
She was like 20.
Wow.
Cranking out
Greatest
Poker
hits
Face.
at 20. Yeah.
Whoa.
Anyway, Booster Gold is going to be an HBO series.
Booster Gold. Very excited for this.
Safran said it's about a loser from the future who uses basic future technology to be kind of a superhero in the modern day.
Yeah. Yeah. I had heard of this character, but I was trying to do a little bit of research and watched an old episode of the Justice League show, Justice League Unlimited, actually, the cartoon show. And it's an episode about Booster Gold. It was cool. Like, it's about how he's asked to do, so the Justice League is like fighting some big monster, and he's asked to just do crowd control because he's useless. And he's like talking to Batman. He's like, I can do all this other stuff. And Batman's like, no, crowd control. That's what you're doing. Shut up.
What this reminds me of is Syndrome from The Incredibles, who, you know, so desperately as a kid wants to be a superhero.
Right.
And is kind of blown off by Mr. Incredible. And it puts him on this path towards being a supervillain, giving himself, you know, these technologically enhanced, quote unquote, superhero powers. And that's really what this reminds me of.
Well, and James Gunn said imposter syndrome
Right.
as a superhero.
Exactly.
Imposter syndrome. But the episode that I watched was interesting because he quickly is like pretty open and like, I'm a fraud, you know? So he's asked to do crowd control, and then he sees other events happening that he decides to go and address. And he ends up really helping people who need his help. And so it's like his journey of being like, I want to be here, I want to help, I want to be a superhero, but I kind of know that I'm useless. Mm-hmm. And until he found an opportunity to actually make a difference, he just felt like he was, you know, not doing anything at all. And so I'm sure the show will take something similar. But yeah, it's a walking imposter syndrome. Chris Pratt could probably make it really fun and light. We talked about Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander on The Boys, the Superman guy with the blonde hair. And that really looks the part. I kind of question if he would be as, fun and relatable as someone like Chris Pratt. I could really see Chris Pratt being like, I mean, Star-Lord has a little bit of that. He's like a kid in an adult's body.
Right.
So I think that lends itself closer to Booster Gold in some ways than Anthony Starr does. Anthony Starr is good at being like scary, like funny scary. So, but he could do a great job too, I'm sure. Or maybe somebody new. But I'm excited for this one because it's so different. It's so weird. He's kind of a comic favorite. It's a good choice.
That'll be fun. Next up, we have Supergirl, excuse me,
What? Oh,
Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow.
Yes.
The Super Wonder Woman.
The Super Wonder Tomorrow Woman.
So this is a classic character, Supergirl. Sorry, that was a little loud.
It's okay. Me too sometimes.
She was raised on a rock, a chip off of Krypton.
Chip off the old Kryptonian block.
Yep, exactly. And watched everyone around her die and be killed in terrible ways for the first 14 years of her life on her way to Earth. That is a tough upbringing for Supergirl.
Yeah, sounds like a cheery start to a show.
She is much more hardcore and not the Supergirl we're used to, says Saffron.
But is she the Supergirl we're being introduced to in the coming year? That's the question.
That is a good question. In which project?
The Flash.
Ooh.
So, rumor has it, spoiler warning, potentially, for anybody listening. So shut your ears if you don't want to hear this. It's just a rumor. Might not be true. But if it is, then you'll hate me. In The Flash, it's rumored, I think Zod goes back in time and like kills Superman as a baby. So I think Ezra's not the only one jumping around time and dimensions or whatever. So I think a baby Superman dies, which sort of results in Supergirl being the primary Kryptonian on Earth. And so she's in this. She's got dark hair. She's played by Sasha Calle. Looks different than the comic book Supergirl, but she is, what's Supergirl's name again? Kal-El and Kara Zor-El? Something like that. Oof, bad. Not remembering right now. But Kara, it is something. Kara something. It's the same character that Sasha Calle is playing. So my question is, the ultimate events of The Flash, is that going to wipe that Supergirl out of existence along with, Ben Affleck, presumably Michael Keaton? Is the end of the movie going to wash all of that away, or is she going to stick around? Or is it left in such a way that it could go either way, and it's going to be the studio's decision to be like, was she well received in that movie? She was? Okay, we'll keep her. That could save the job of having to cast for that movie.
Well, and I think all of us are making some assumptions that there are going to be some reshoots involved with The Flash, at least in terms of where that movie ends and what direction they may take some of the post-credit type things, leaving some breadcrumbs for the projects that they've now teed up down the road.
I thought I saw some magazine ask James Gunn a question like that, and he said something like that they might do some minor tweaks, but they really don't have to. Like something about the way the movie's made just resets. Blanket slate. Or blanket, I don't know. Yeah, apparently I don't know if they actually have reshot anything. They might have removed things like featuring Wonder Woman, like things that might have alluded to a larger DCEU. They might have cut just to make it more self-contained. But I don't think they're really changing the story to make it fit their narrative at all.
I guess we'll find out.
I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to that. What goes on behind the scenes at studios? What are executive notes to filmmakers having a clue.
Well, especially for a project like this that has had so many changes along the
Oh.
way.
Yeah. They also apparently want to keep Andy Muschietti around making movies. DC does. James Gunn does.
Okay.
He directed The Flash.
Okay.
And the It movies. Those are like his big successes. And so if this movie is as good as they think it's going to be, they're going to want to keep Andy Muschietti around as a filmmaker as well. You know, like having the Russo brothers around for Avengers movies. If they do something good, you're like, well, maybe more. James Gunn himself, Marvel. Taika Waititi.
Well,
The list goes on.
The nice thing about The Flash is that if it's a huge success, James Gunn can use that to parlay some momentum and excitement about the future of DC. And if it's not a great project and people don't like it as much, they can say, well, that was from a previous era, and they can kind of distance themselves from what's going to come down the road.
Right, and that's the end of that.
Yeah.
So
I'm excited about that movie, don't get me wrong, but they've
man.
left themselves some options.
And least of all, 2 Batmans.
Yeah.
2 Batmans.
Yeah, I
One
know.
movie. I think there's going to be a little bit of Spider-Man No Way Home. They watched the success of that movie. They want some of that. If those Batmans don't interact, I'll be very surprised. The Flashes are going to interact. They're going to team up. I think there's going to be a moment when a Batman talks to a Batman, which is wild and even weirder in some ways than Spider-Man, because
Yeah.
Batman's so like, you know, closed off. Like, what would he say to himself? He'd be like, hey, bye. You know, that'd be it. Like, but it'd be funny if it was even that, like even just a look of like,
If a child Connor could only imagine that future that's ahead of him.
I may cry.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Looking
It's
forward to
happened
that.
before.
All right. Last but not least, the final project that's been announced is Swamp Thing. I'm really excited about this. They are calling it a horror film.
Yeah.
And we know that Marvel recently has been experimenting a little bit with this. They came out with Werewolf by Night, which was in mostly black and white, shot as kind of a classic horror movie. That said, it definitely had more of kind of a Marvel sheen over it, which most Marvel projects kind of have that.
It did, but as you're saying, that style, I don't know, made it feel more like the Universal Monsters movies of decades and decades ago than it did like a Marvel project. And I think it's going to be, like you said, much closer to that.
I guess what I'm saying is for this Swamp Thing project, I'm expecting, just knowing the history of DC and knowing the direction that they're going in, I wouldn't be surprised if this is more of a straight up horror movie.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. It will be. Yeah, and I guess Werewolf by Night is held back horror-wise by the Marvel stuff, but not too much. It's very much constructed like a horror thing and shot like a horror thing. I think it'll definitely be like that. You know, Creature Commandos, like I said, has Frankenstein in it, so they're also planting seeds of like a monster side to DC, much in the way that like Werewolf by Night is building a monsters side of Marvel. But yeah, I think, like I said, Universal like monsters feel. I think both studios would be wise to just lean into that really hard, like campy. Like if you're gonna do kind of horror things
Just
in a
go all
superhero universe, you have to be a little campy.
Absolutely.
It's kind of more fun that way. But Swamp Thing is a very beloved character. There was a DC television show that got canceled after one season. If I can dig it up, we should watch it. It was apparently pretty good. You learn about Swamp Thing. He was a human being. He became this Swamp Thing. The character's evolved in the comics, but now he's this like immensely powerful being that's connected to the whole ecosystem of everything, and like he appears in the recent Harley Quinn TV show, the one that's raunchy and has swearing, and she's, you know, in a relationship with Poison Ivy. That whole show, they like go to visit Swamp Thing to help with some Poison Ivy stuff with plants, and because he can like communicate with plants and is really, really powerful with all earth things. But he's a great character, and he's really beloved, and he's actually powerful and important, and is a big part of the universe. So I'm just excited to see him. And if James Mangold directs, I mean, Logan, one of the best superhero movies ever. He's just a great director in general, James Mangold. He's
That
done
would be
tons
really
of stuff.
exciting. Or you mentioned that the director of It has also been involved in the DC universe.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
he made The Flash.
so
That's
that
what
would
I'm
be
saying.
interesting too. I mean, just knowing It, you know, having a much darker feel for a project like Swamp Thing could be
That's true.
interesting.
Yeah, that is true.
So that is the end of the lineup that's been announced so far. So let's close it out with what some kind of big picture takeaways that we took from these announcements are. Starting with just, you know, how are we feeling? You know, are you, of course you're excited. How excited are you?
I'm excited. I think it's a good blend of things, like we talked about. New characters, existing characters. It's not the slate I imagined, but I'm happy with it, you know? It's not the slate I needed, but it's the slate I deserved. Something like that, because I trust him, you know? A lot of times when you think about superhero movies, you think, what's the coolest thing I could possibly want in my head? And comic book people forget that what works in the comics does not always work cinematically. They are fundamentally different. They're different ways of telling stories. There's so many things that are different. Like, what makes a great movie and what makes a great comic book are not the same. Sometimes not even close. You know, you really have to juggle a lot of balls. Like, at the end of the day, The Dark Knight is a better movie. It's more focused on being a good movie than it is faithful to its source material. And I think you have to be willing to do that a little bit. And so I'm just glad that someone who likes comics this much, like James Gunn, because I also liked that about Zack Snyder. So that's still there. He's more transparent. And yeah, he's going to introduce us to new characters, the ones we know. But like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm excited that it's not what I expected, because I have a belief in my heart that that's probably going to turn out for the best. You know, when you get what you don't think you want, I think a lot of times it ends up being better, you know?
Well, particularly because of this superhero fatigue. You know, people are tired of, even though it's been a very successful formula, there is a formula for making Marvel movies, and there's a bit of, you know, burnout, I would say, among audience for that. And so I'm excited, like you said, about being surprised. I think that's one of my favorite parts of James Gunn as a director is you didn't really know what you were going to get. I went into that Guardians of the Galaxy movie thinking I don't know any of these characters, and now that's one of my very favorite movies from that era of the Marvel universe. And it was a fun blockbuster experience just to go along for the ride. He gets that movies are about having a good time, particularly if you're going to see a comic book movie. Yeah. And so I think that allows them to pivot, kind of move away from this darker tone. I'm sure they'll still have projects that are, you know, more along with that, but have a little bit more tools in the toolbox, if you know what I mean.
Totally. Well, and Brave and the Bold is going to be much lighter, but it's Batman. It's not going to be Guardians of the Galaxy. So I think James Gunn does know that well. And also, like I said before, I think he's surveyed, like, because they're starting completely from scratch in a way, they have the opportunity to kind of start over, and they're being given the benefit of the doubt from the fan community. I really think he has surveyed the landscape. I mean, we keep comparing these projects to things that have come out recently or that we're aware of, like Werewolf by Night for Swamp Thing. Because Swamp Thing's going to be dark, horror. That's not going to feel like a James Gunn movie. It's not going to feel like going to see Guardians of the Galaxy and, oh, the soundtrack's so good. Right. It's not going to be like that. So I think it's going to have the James Gunn touch for a lot of things. And I think he's also just looked across the whole genre and being like, well, what works and what doesn't? And like, yeah, make a horror thing, like, because Marvel had success with that, and make an R-rated thing like The Boys. You know, Marvel hasn't been able to do that yet because Marvel created this really clear brand, and as they're trying to branch out from that, that comes with its challenges. in some ways, this DC universe is starting in an opposite place where they have the ability to just be like, all right, well, we're setting a new tone. What's that tone going to be? It's going to be varied. We're going to be here, up there a little bit, you know?
Well, and I have a quote from James Gunn from this interview he gave that I think is kind of elucidating on that front. He said, it's not the Gunn verse. It's not. It's got to be all these different feels from all these different stories. That's what makes it so fun. The stories are completely different, and each has the individual expression of the writers and the director that are making those projects.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. And he's smart enough to know that, and that's going to make it different than the Snyderverse, too.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you said that you were surprised by a couple things. Before we head off, what was the biggest surprise?
Oh, well, surprised in some ways, I guess, by how much of what is staying. Before the announcement with Cavill and everything, it sounded like, wow, maybe they're just going to completely wipe the slate clean and there's going to be like a clear cutoff from DCEU to DCU. But now the line's going to be blurred. You know, when you watch all of those movies, if you squint really hard, maybe it'll look like it was all one shared universe for all those years, you know, from Man of Steel all the way to whatever. Maybe you can be like, oh, well, the Flash kind of works in the middle there to mix everything up. And so, yeah, it's kind of one thing. So that's nice. It may retroactively make the beginnings of the universe stronger.
Sure.
Or at least fit in. So, and then I was surprised by, we've talked about nepotism, Nepo babies. I mean, and I don't want to lob any accusations at James Gunn, but it did strike me that his brother, his wife, who have played characters in the DC projects that he was a part of, are sticking around, you know, conveniently. They were also some of the most high box office success movies, so he has a business justification too. Like, it's not a hard sell to the studio.
Right.
But it's noticeable that has remained, you know, and The Rock is a big draw, and I guess they obviously just were not happy with that movie and it didn't make enough money. Because it's interesting for them to be like, bye to The Rock, but like, sure, James Gunn, you can keep your wife as an actress in these movies.
Well, and some of the subtext of what's been shared has been that different creators could kind of go up the ladder and get whatever they wanted. And there has been, you know, some suggestions that maybe The Rock was taking advantage of that. That's how they got Henry Cavill to appear at the end of that. And then they did a kind of an about face with that and removed him from what seems to be the future of the DCU.
And to be fair, James Gunn's wife shows up in Black Adam for just a moment, but she's there, and James Gunn didn't make that movie. He didn't have anything to do with that movie. Yeah. That's just DC trying to make some connective tissue. So I guess it's already there, you know, to some degree. So anyway, not lobbing any whatevers at him, and Sean Gunn's also in the Guardians movies. But it's funny because he started out as kind of a very small role and has grown fairly prominent. So
Kraglin, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But maybe that's earned. I only bring it up because Nepo babies are just a huge conversation right now, and neither of those people are babies.
Sure.
But it's just a big topic these days, so it occurred to me, you know, and no one has picked up on it that I've seen. Everyone's so excited about the announcements themselves. I haven't really seen anybody. Actually, one YouTube channel is the only person I've really seen mention it. And journalists should be doing their work a little better and probably mentioning it. It's not all about, oh, Damian Wayne, cool, Swamp Thing. There's deeper things too you can explore in all of this news. You know, So.
Well, to leave it on a happier note here.
Yeah, let's not leave it on that.
What project are you most excited to see from what's been announced?
Well, I have a hard time not mentioning Brave and the Bold.
Of course.
I have been getting excited about Batman projects since I was 12 years old and following them on the internet religiously. I cried when the Dark Knight Rises came out. It was like the end of a chapter of my life. So that, but Lanterns for sure. I happen to be a True Detective fan. It was a great show. The Paradise Lost as well. Swamp Thing for sure. I guess maybe all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Booster Gold and Waller. Those are the live action ones.
So only 6 of the 8.
Yeah.
I think for me, Lanterns is the one I'm most excited for. I love the idea, the concept. Green Lantern is one of my favorite superheroes from the DC side. And so to see them explore 2 incarnations of Green Lanterns should be really fun. Just really excited to see what comes out of that.
And apparently that one, they're going to uncover some mystery or something that ties into the much larger DC universe. So of these projects, it may be one of the least self-contained, like that has more broad stretching impacts. Whereas like Paradise Lost is probably going to be mostly dealing with the events of just that show. Yeah. If I had to put it in a better order, yeah, the things that I'm genuinely excited for that I didn't think I would be like Waller, Lanterns, and Swamp Thing, probably. Those are some of the top. Yeah.
Well, we're going to have a lot to talk about over the next couple of years.
Yep. We'll have a lot to talk about in the next coming weeks.
Yes, next week
I'm sure what you're about to say.
Exactly. Next week we'll be previewing Ant-Man Quantumania. We'll be doing a little bit of a recap of the character of Ant-Man up to this point. We had intended to talk about this week, but with the James Gunn announcements coming out, a little more important.
Yeah. Well, the timing is there, but if we can get an episode out before the 17th, which we should be able to, actually we're seeing it on the 16th on Thursday night. We'll definitely want to talk about that. That's going to be very exciting, and a whole new villain for a whole new chapter of Marvel, and talk about villains I'm excited for.
Absolutely. Yeah, we got a lot coming up this year, and this is definitely a project I'm excited for.
It's a good time to start a podcast. I mean, even like we said, you said 4 DC movies this year, 2 Marvel movies, maybe 3.
I think at least 3.
Guardians 3, Quantumania. What else? And I'm sure there's some shows. Secret Invasion.
They usually come out with a Thanksgiving, Christmas time movie. I can't remember what it is. But.
Right. But there's a lot. And then 2024 will be a little more quiet, at least on the DC side. And then 2025 will offer a lot. So it's we've got our work cut out for us.
Looking forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah. And for all the weeks in the foreseeable future, for years and years. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Until next time.